Hi everyone, my name is Pavel Dolega and I am CTO at Virtus Lab.
Hi, I'm Krzysztof Romanowski. I'm team lead of the Scala 3 team here at Virtus Lab.
Welcome to the third day of the ScalaCon conference. So we have pleasure to talk today and to briefly introduce you to what we think is the future of the Scala, and specifically Scala 3 as seen by the Virtus Lab team. So to give you a little bit information about the agenda, given that we are doing a lot of work right now behind the commercial software and work around the core compiler and the tools around the compiler, it might be worth to talk a little bit about the history of Virtus Lab and the context. Why, specifically from the perspective of why do we think that there is a good fit between our company and how it can help Scala grow. Then we'll switch to the business context and how we think it will affect the growth of the Scala. And then Krzysztof will talk about the roadmaps, about some things, roadmaps of some things that we are working on, and we'll wrap it up with the future and some adoption barriers. So without further ado, let's start. And I'm going to give you this, this brief context about the Virtus Lab, just to know from where we are coming from. So very briefly, as a company, Virtus Lab has been started roughly 10 years ago. And we were started as a software company, software services company, which means that we specifically either did software development and software consultancy for our customers. And back then, we were mostly working, so remember that was like 2010, we were mostly working with the application level programming. We did maybe work around, I don't know, reactive systems or maybe about services, micro or not. And back in the day, I think that the typical stack and the tools that we used were basically the ones provided and built by TypeSafe, so things like Akka, Play. We did some work about Scala IDE. I think that it's fair to say that at that time in our company, we treated Scala as a golden hammer. Maybe not a golden hammer, but maybe rather as a golden multi-tool. So we applied the Scala language to any problem that we basically had back in the day. And our foray into tooling, which is interesting for that context, had, for instance, happened in 2015 when we worked in the Scala IDE and we cooperated with TypeSafe back then to make sure that there is an alternative for the IntelliJ IDEA when it comes to the IDE for Scala. But really, our work around tooling and around things related to the tooling ecosystem in Scala started much earlier. So I think it might have been 2013 or 2014. And some of this work trickled down into the community from the work that we did for some of big customers when we worked in the area of the tooling. So there might have been some more obscure work which was related to making sure that large Scala code bases, for instance, when we work for Fortune 500 customers, making sure that the code bases that might have been one of the biggest code bases in the world compiled well and were performant in the area of tooling. So this might be work that might have improved, for instance, some incremental compilation by 1 or 2 percentage points, which might have been not very visible for a typical Scala project, but was very important for us for the work that we did at that scale. And these experiences started early with the tooling, led us around 2016 to found a conference which was called Scalasphere. And the Scalasphere conference was essentially an event that gathered all people that worked in the Scala and specifically in the Scala and tooling niche in the ecosystem. So as you can imagine, back then there might have been not that many people, maybe 100 or so folks throughout the world that were interested in that subject. But nonetheless, this first event was a success, and there were many interesting things. For instance, one of the things was that I think that was the first event when the Coursier by Alex Archambault was presented. There were a lot of interesting conversations happening, some of them that led to significant or some part of the design, for instance, behind SBT 1.0. And the conference later on grew into a much bigger event. So before the pandemics, it might have been roughly 600 people, and we talked about many different things, not only about the Scala tooling itself. Later on, we started the cooperation. I think that might have been roughly 2 years ago with the Scala Center, but I'm not going to go into details with that because this is something that we'll cover in a moment. Let's just do a fast forward to last year, to 2020. So around the time, around the beginning of the pandemics that happened last year, there was also news circulating in Twitter about some people leaving Lightbend. And those people were in the past working and in the area of the compiler and things around that, basically around Scala ecosystem. So that was important point because at that time there was the point where sort of a transition from Scala 2 to Scala 2 to Scala 3 happened, and when we started to have this sort of a handover when it comes to the commercial support for the Scala language. So a little bit later after that, in July 2020, Martin Oderski joined Virtus Lab as an external advisor, and our cooperation got tighter by then. So it is important to know at that point that by 2020, at that time, we were not only doing the same things that we were doing, nearly 5 or 10 years ago, that is focused basically on the application level development in Scala. In fact, we worked on the cloud native software. We worked on the cloud infrastructure when some of the teams might have been using Golang. We worked, for instance, on the front end when some of the teams might have been using TypeScript, or we worked in the data area where we might as well use Python. So it's fair to say that back in the day, 1 year ago, Scala was not anymore a golden hammer in Virtus Lab and the work that we did with customers around the world. It was still a hammer, a fine tool that is useful thing that's when you want to pound a nail, but not necessarily very useful if you want to unscrew the screw. So if if we go to the numbers, I think that back then the business around Scala and things related to it might have contributed to 50% of the business that Virtus Lab was doing. And it might be interesting the question is, why am I even talking about this? I'm talking about this because I think that it positions us neatly in a very good position to help with the further Scala adoption in the business and in the industry. So first of all, we have a long history with Scala, and that's nearly 10 years when we work with Scala and the ecosystem. Scala is still a crucial part of our business, so it's 50%, right? So not even mentioning the fact that if this 50% evaporated overnight, we would be basically dead. But even if it diminishes over time, it's not very comfortable for us as a company. We also have a good grasp on the industry. So the fact that we are a service company, that we do software development and software consultancy means that we work with many different customers. So we work with many different teams, many different cultures. We see many different problems, many approaches to solving those problems. And last but not least, the fact that we are working with customers that might have outright rejected, for instance, Scala for some reason, or might have switched Scala and decided that for the new projects they would be using Golang. It's also gives us an interesting perspective into how customers and how business perceives Scala and what might be needed to further its adoption. And that leads us, that's sort of that concludes the part about the context, and it leads us to this business setting of Scala and how we see the way forward. So I took this chart. It's a common hype chart from Gartner, but I specifically refer to Lee Howie blog post about the beyond hype for the Scala language. So many people agree that the peak of the inflated expectation and the general hype might have happened or might have ended sometime around maybe 2014, maybe 2015, maybe 2016. And many people would argue that we are even past the trough of disillusionment. So we might be as well somewhere along the slope of enlightenment. So why is it important? It is important because we believe that the means and the things that help the Scala grow in adoption and make it popular, things that were while we were in this part of the cycle before the peak of inflated expectation, aren't necessarily the same things that would help us to grow Scala right now. And the other thing that I wanted to mention, and we'll circle back to that later on, is that we in Virtus Lab don't believe that it's a zero-sum game. So obviously, as a company which is a commercial entity, one of our goals is to basically grow as a company, make profit, etc., etc. But what we think is that in the Scala ecosystem, it's not really at this point. It's not useful to think about it as that much as a competition, even in a limited market, which is, comparing to other mainstream languages, is fairly small. And instead, we think that it's much more beneficial to everyone, including us, to make sure that the pie is getting bigger, that the Scala ecosystem grows, that there are more companies that want to build products with Scala, there are more employers that want to employ Scala developers, and there are more Scala developers on the market. Which means that from our perspective, we are in a stage where the cooperation is needed. And even in the commercial entities that are normally competing on the market, we believe that for those competing commercial entities like software houses, software consultancies, there is still a cooperation needed. There is a term coined, used by economists, which is called co-petition, which means the cooperation between different entities who are normally competitors, for instance, for achieving the greater goal. And we think that this is what the Scala and the Scala ecosystem needs right now.
Any competition, cooperation, any services, it's not possible without the team. And I'm showing you two faces that you might know. You might recognize Alex, you might recognize Tomek from the amazing work on Metals and Crucier and Almond. And that's probably the only two faces that you recognize that you can connect with Virtus Lab. Alex joined quite recently. Tomek is with us for like long time. But that's not the whole team. There's more than just three of us. The whole team is this group of amazing people that we built over since last year, basically. So the work that they are doing might not surface yet. They are still in the development, but they are working hard. And the things that we got that, I wish I can share with you right now, but there are things that are not mature enough to share with outside world. But so watch this space. This is going to be really exciting things coming out of this group of people. And speaking about teams, there is a Scala 3 team at EPFL and Scala Center as well. And we work closely with them. Since Martin joined Virtus Lab as the technical advisor, we tightened our cooperation, and since then we are present at the Scala 3 team, so we work closely. Pavel and Michał currently is working on the compiler stuff, working with the language for the language. There are exciting things going on. Back then, we will again release them soon, and we prove that they are working, and then not to inflate expectations too much. And there is also a Scala doc that we took over basically from the day zero with help from Aleksander Boruszewski, and we with Filip, Andrzej, and Kasper trying to develop it and bring it to all of you. But I mentioned Scala Center. We cannot forget about Scala Center. Scala Center is one of the main pillars of the Scala community right now. And we're really honored and privileged to be a member of the advisory board at Scala Center and cooperate with Scala Center directly on Metals, on Scala Native. But our cooperation does not end at the technical matters. We also work on the community, to grow the community. We started contributor summits like 2 years ago, but we do not want to stop. We really believe that the language and the ecosystem for growth requires inclusive, open, and community where people feel safe and can grow and learn. And this is really important, and we want to cooperate with Scala Center to make our community better. And this is probably obvious, but I must say it loud that there is no such thing as as a Virtus Lab version of Scala. We are working together with Scala Center, with Martin, teams at EPFL, to make Scala into the best thing as it can be, to make our community as grow and be for everyone, and to expand the tooling and ecosystem.
So the other thing is, because that was the cooperation, the state of the cooperation from the formal and business perspective of the Scala Center between Virtus Lab, Scala Center, and EPFL. The other thing is I want us to talk about is commercial support. So the commercial support, as I said, was historically done by Lightbend. They did a great work for the Scala 2, and the Scala support for the Scala 3 is going to be done these days by Virtus Lab. So we already have things prepared, and we are going to start with the commercial offering in Q3 2021, which is basically in a few weeks. Why is it important? You may ask, the Scala 3 is just barely has been released. There are no production systems that are run in the with Scala 3, so it's probably not a big deal. But the thing here is that we believe after conversations with many of the customers that basically there are two things. One of them is that for many large organizations like think Fortune 500s or FTSE 100 in Europe, there are certain legal requirements or checkboxes they need to check. Like for instance, if they want to use open source, they need to make sure that there is a commercial entity doing a commercial support for that particular thing. So this allows some businesses, and especially large businesses, and we strongly believe that we need large businesses to make sure that Scala 3 grows. It makes it eligible for these companies. The other thing is that we are going to not only cover production systems, but more also focus on the experience, on how the team starts, on the mentoring and things like that. And last but not least, we are really aiming here and trying to make sure that from the business perspective, everything works and the Scala is feasible for bigger companies. To that extent, we don't even intend to make a profit on this thing. We rather, maybe if we are breaking even, that's fine. But what we are thinking about is how we make sure that this helps with the adoption. And to that extent, we are going to do this like for the smaller companies or for the smaller teams within bigger companies to have the support, which can start even with single-digit thousands of dollars a year, which is basically comparing to commercial supports when software is basically cents. The other thing is training and certifications, and we really would like to, we see it as a second side of the same coin. When you talk, with business and especially large organizations, there is need for this commercial support, and it's ideal when there is some kind of a certification path. So we are intending to start the certification path in Q4 2021, and there would be probably some training that we provide for that, but we also believe in the spirit that was said previously about these, cooperation in the community and even between different commercial entities. We believe that there are great companies doing, software consultancies, to name a few, maybe 47 Degrees that is organizing this conference, or maybe, Software Wheel or Scala C, all the companies that we work with on daily basis, and we appreciate the work, and I believe that there will be plenty of great companies doing trainings. So we probably focus first on the certification path to make sure that from the business perspective, this checkbox is being checked. And it's worth to emphasize that certifications are specifically in more bigger demand in the emerging or developing economies, which means that economies that people have less money than in the developed countries, which leads us to the natural conclusions that, again, this is not going to be intended on making money. It is intending to making the certification accessible for people from different geographical locations and from different economies.
So you might ask what we are going to support. So the Scala 3 is obvious thing, but we also want to include metals in that. And I just want to say it to be clear, we do not claim any kind of ownership on the Scala 3 or metals. What we want to focus on are the services, because we are the service company, and especially the services that neither Scala Center nor Martin and his team cannot provide. So the service is really closely related to corporate and companies and working with them, and that's where we see ourselves. What are those services, you might ask? So we see it as the first mentoring, onboarding, and troubleshooting. So helping teams, helping people work and start and build things using Scala, but not in the open source world where you cannot share the details of your top secret project that you're working on. But we, as being a corporate entity, we are able to sign deals that will allow us to work in the context of the projects that the developers in your company are using at daily basis. And we are in that business for quite a while. Maybe not officially announcing support for a big thing like Scala, but working with the clients. And I be on both ends. Like I was the one that was requesting this kind of support, and I was the one that was providing those support. And I know how much of the difference access to the context means for the speed and the quality of the services, in that case, that we can offer. And on top of that, we also think about custom integrations, because this is also what we do for quite a while, where we can take Metals, Scala 3, but pretty much anything that is made of a Scala ecosystem, in terms of tooling, in terms of libraries, and shape and match them to what given company needs, what given company uses. So there is no, because sometimes when you have a tooling that everybody is using in the, let's say, open source world, and there is a corporate thing, corporate world, and those things and those world doesn't match, and people feel frustrated because they want to use the kind of amazing tools like Metals, but they cannot because of the restrictions. And we, as a Virtus Lab, are here to help. So as Pavel mentioned, making money on that corporate support is not our main goal. Our main goal is to actually to expand. So the Scala, there is no barrier for Scala to expand, and it also means no barrier for Metals to expand. And if we are talking about Scala 3 and commercially support, like enabling that Scala and all the features that Scala 3 provides, like Tasty, into the ecosystem of your company that might not use only SBT, might use Gradle, might use Bazel, might use something else, something custom. And it's not as simple as providing support to compile code with Scala 3. But in bigger projects, all the attention is being put to the things like how to make it efficiently, how to reuse, how to cache stuff. And this is where we want to help. And obvious thing is the migration. And we did in the past with some of our partners and clients quite a huge migration. We had migrate million lines of Scala code from 2.10 to 11 or 2.11 to 12. And there's multiple questions that you probably will ask when you start doing it, like, should I migrate all at once? Should I maintain two versions of the code? With Been There, we can help you decide, and we can help you guide you through that process. And speaking of Metals, the need for backing is, I think, is even more needed for tools like Metals, where a lot of, I would fear that a lot of developers that want to use Metals are not able because of the missing checkbox that there is someone that can provide support. And onboarding Metals is also harder because it might be not as simple as putting a few jars into a company Artifactory. It might require more work to work with the proxy and other stuff. And just the developers that are like given a task and want to just install Metals might have problems. And this is where we can also help. Because we believe now, after so many years of work on Metals, that the Metals are at the point that it's stable, it's fast, it's efficient enough, so it can be without any kind of doubts and things used in the enterprise world. And a lot of people is using Metals right now. So I will get a lot of questions after that. I think about, am I saying that we say that IntelliJ should be replaced with Metals? No, it's all about alternative. I've read today some story that there was a company that was trying to decide whether to pick Kotlin or Go. And one of the arguments that the Go was picked was because Kotlin does not has a support for like proper support in editors that the company were using because they were developing code previously in Python. And we don't want this kind of arguments to pop up in case of Scala. That is why we need Metals. And Metals and IntelliJ might compete, might sell the same thing, but they got they solve the problem differently, and they sit in different spot on the spectrum from editor to IDE. And there is a lot of overlap. But I do not believe that there is a right answer between IntelliJ and Metals. And at this very moment, people in my teams actually building stuff around IntelliJ. And I personally using IntelliJ at my daily work as well as Metals. So I think Scala needs both IntelliJ and Metals. And this is the perfect example of this competition that Pavel mentioned earlier. There is a Scala native. We do not mention it as the scope of commercial support because Scala native is still beta, in the beta phase. But after, I think in the last year, there was amazing progress done to the Scala native. It was updated to Scala 2.13. There was a lot of new features. The stability is much better, and especially I hope that you were able to check the amazing blog post from Wojtek, that is maintainer of the Scala native, when he compares the performance and the numbers that Scala native is able to produce. Means that in some specific cases, especially with the cold start or the memory utilization is a key, Scala native might bring Scala into the ecosystem, into the niches that previously Scala was not able to be used. It's like few people back 2 years back had doubts if Scala JS is a good idea. Now I think nobody argues that Scala JS was a bad idea. And we believe as a Virtus Lab, and me personally, that the Scala native can be a fully supported third runtime when Scala can run. So for everybody that might have a use case where the Scala native strength might be critical, I think it might be a good time. And so the risk of being early adopters, because there will be risk, there will be bugs, there will be shortcomings. I cannot promise that it's bulletproof. But those risks and those problems may be outweighed by the benefits that Scala brings as a language and also Scala native in terms of the performance. So now, let's talk about roadmaps. Metals 1.0 is coming. It's coming hopefully this year. And there is a 4 things that we want to have in Metals 1.0. So first is, so the Scala 3 support is on par with Scala 2. Scala 3 is well supported in Metals, but there is a few things that are there for Scala 2, but are not for Scala 3. And we want to make it even, so there is no difference between Scala 2 and Scala 3. Hopefully, in the next few months, we'll get all of those things. Then the thing that is also being developed at this very moment is expression evaluation capabilities in the debugger. This is, for at least for me personally, one of the most needed things in Metals, where when I need to switch to other options, when I need this kind of capabilities. Then there is a set, we want to complete our set of refactorings and code actions. So they match most of the most dire and mostly needed actions in daily life, and also focus on stability in terms of what information, how we interact with user, and also how the project is supported. Because for Metals, it's not like a single application. It is a set of multiple JVMs and things talking over the networks and other things. So it might get stale at some point, and you want to provide quite a clear story to recover from that problem, especially that will be really beneficial especially from the corporate settings. And as for the Scala native, we do not plan a big number, big release version as for Metals, but there's solid plans for this year. So first, I think that is the first version is being reviewed at this very moment is the support for Windows, because previously developers on Windows had limited options to use Scala native. Now, hopefully, they will be able to fully enjoy Scala native. And then support for the Scala 3 and the foundation for multi-threading. Those are like the two important. Scala 3 is important to move Scala native forward together with Scala, and multi-threading is like for the very serious business use cases, not only business use cases, multi-threading is a key. So with that, there are the roadmaps for Scala native and Metals.
And the last thing perhaps that we wanted to talk about today is the adoption barriers. So looking into the future. And to start with that, it might be worth again to move back in time to coincidentally to the early days of our company, 2010, 2014. And if you look at these local hypes that we've put here, most of them did not exist back then. I think Cloud Native Foundation was found maybe 2015. Docker might have been found maybe 2013 or something like that. If they were existent, they were pretty much of a limited use. And yet, if and that shows, right? If you think about that's a screenshot from the Wayback Machine, from TypeScript page back then. If you look at the stack and how it's built, you see there's a virtual machine, Java virtual machine. There is a Scala inside. There is Akka. There might be a plain web framework that might have been, using and exposing maybe single page application, or maybe just rendered, and send some HTTP from the server side. And even you can notice on the left-hand side that it says about deployment on the on-prem server, perhaps on some VMware, or deploying on the EC2. So these days, the world were pretty much focused on the application layer. And yet, as it often happens with the technology, the cycle, we moved in the cycle to the further stage. And what happened is that there are a lot of those things that we were doing in the application side were moved to the infrastructure area. So for instance, if we take things like Netflix library Hystrix, which was used for things like communication, for instance, between different services, things like circuit breakers, exponential backups. So this is initially a library which was later on moved into something like, for instance, server mesh, and the library itself was discontinued. And the service mesh itself is going to be soon commoditized by cloud providers and provided together with the Kubernetes clusters or Kubernetes services. So this leads us to this conclusion. So what we are seeing on the market, talking with different companies, is that the world is pretty much different from what we see in the Scala ecosystem on Twitter, or what we even a few years ago seen on various different conferences. So we often talk on conferences about things like, I don't know, I/O and things like that, or application level programming about the ethics and things like that. Whereas what we see in typical use cases in many organizations is that they deal a lot with stuff like infrastructure as code. They deal a lot with glue code, maybe written in Golang, that connects their services, which are, by the way, deployed now in several different services. And maybe they use some message bus, they need to build some containers and stuff. And it's even worse the other way around, because like the first thing is that typical Scala developer these days does a lot more of this stuff that he or she used to do in a several years ago. But it's even worse the other way around, because many of the people that specialize, for instance, in infrastructure as code, or maybe they are more into the DevOps part, things like Kubernetes, they also need to modify some of the services. And that means that we'll see, and by the way, that's the comment from the same blog post by Lee Howie, the blog post about the past the hype of the Scala, or beyond the hype from Scala hype. And we can see that this gentleman is not happy that it's a problem to work with the Scala code base, especially if you go from one project to the other and need to refactor a thing. Think how this particular service has been built, because there are so many different options. And when we talk to different people in the community, and most of these people are not even on Twitter, or they are not necessarily going to conferences, they talk about many different things, and like there are some themes that are repeating. So things like many people complain about build complexity, or the fact that SBT is unintuitive for them, or the fact that they need to build containers or publish something and it works if you have a very simple case, but in their production application it ain't that simple anymore, and they have problems because it's difficult to tackle that. Some people complain about documentation that is written in a way that explains things in an abstract term and doesn't show, for instance, the examples. And last but not least, there is this phenomenon which is called paradox of choice. So you can envision this as a person coming, for instance, from Python. And when this developer comes, for instance, into Golang, it's fairly easy and quickly to start doing, a service that would consume and send JSON somewhere. And if you look at how, a new developer, a newcomer behaves with the Scala stack, it's completely different. The number of choices that are available makes things very unclear for people. And this beginning journey is especially unrewarding for many people entering into the Scala ecosystem. So all the things that I mentioned, we call them friction, and that's actually the term itself, and the definition was coined by two fellows in our company. Well, the definition as we see it for the Scala, these two fellows being Paweł Prażak and Łukasz Biały. And we define this friction as basically anything that causes you as a developer to diverge your attention or your effort from the core problem that you are supposed to solve. So these might include things like non-intuitive documentation, non-intuitive or hard to understand API, non-obvious choices regarding the libraries and things like that. So just like in physics, the friction is the killer of efficiency. It makes the energy go away. And The worst thing about the friction is that this friction really compounds, and that means that it doesn't compound like money in your bank account. It compounds like a death of 1,000 cuts. You have 1% of friction here, another here, and it, overall over a week of work, when you happen and you stumble upon the same thing over and over again, it compounds to a large and a significant problem. And with that introduction, I wanted to hand over last time to Krzysztof to introduce the frictionless Scala initiative.
So eliminating those frictions, provide as much frictionless Scala ecosystem as possible is probably the main goal for my team right now, where we want to get all of the experience that we get from working with different clients on actually making development tools productive, and get a lot of experience from within the company, from people from different worlds. We switch quite a few people to Scala, and they share their experience about those. This is where we want to this is the fuel for my team to actually make Scala efficient, because we don't have a friction. What I mean by friction, let me give you the example of actual things. So hopefully you can see that's metals and a VS Code, and this is like how many of us develop. So there is some random code on the left, and there is like an application running on the right. And then you are going through the code review or whatever, and then like the application phase, and you are greeted with a stack trace. And the stack trace is there was an amazing keynote yesterday about reading of the code, and the stack trace shows exactly all of the problems with the wrong language. So we have things like here that doesn't really match to the code that we wrote. And let's say the Let's I'm playing as a developer that switched from Kotlin to Scala. And in Kotlin, everybody using Let's as a way to work with the structured code. So the brave chap actually added Let into his code. And then in the structure, he got Let 3 times here. And he called it only once, like what's going on? And also, like, he going through the code, and he actually skipped the focus where, like, he did not look at what is the problem that he have at hand, what caused the problem. He's actually trying to reason what the stack trace provides. And he even got here something like this. When he click here, and when he goes, he's greeted with a definition of a trait. And now he thinks, is the trait different than the interface? Should it mean in terms of the stack trace? And I'm pretty sure that most of you understand what's going on here. And the reason why the stack trace will look as it looks like here is because of how Scala was developed and how Scala is built on top of JVM. But but people that started, they do not want to think about this. And also when I'm developing myself, I'm also spending this extra 30 seconds to get through the stack trace. So what if we can get into the world when the tools can help us to actually build and provide this world without this friction? So take a look. If our stack traces look like this, where we have nicely matched, like we filter out a few pieces of that are not really meant because they are like the way how Scala is encoded. When we expand lambdas to provide as much information as possible, when we also, in the cases where we cannot provide information because we don't have enough information in the bytecode or in the tasty, we say aloud that, okay, we cannot work here, like do some things. And also in this case, actually splitting lambda into multiple lines may also help with the readability in the end. So that is the process. On the really trivial cases of the stack traces, how me and my team want to make Scala frictionless. And it's not only like the general idea. I've got a roadmap for you, but not a roadmap of the actual things that we are going to do. Because those things, if we want to remove friction, we need to build something and if it actually helps. But rather, and what I want to present here is the 4 areas where we start our journey to the removing friction. So those areas are documentation that Pavel mentioned as well previously, where not only the content of the documentation, but mainly the way how the documentation is presented, how people interact with the documentation. And this means like leveraging Scaladoc. That might not be like, it might look as like, downstep from the Scaladoc from Scala 2, but it was actually built in mind to be expanded into something more than just a thing to build a static documentation and API documentation. Then there is also a learning curve within our tools. So when somebody starts his journey through the Scala, he also needs to start a journey with SBT or MIL. And both SBT and MIL are amazing tools, and they moved quite a lot to be as intuitive, but there are still build tools that one need to learn. And there are basic things like publishing, like deploying, that should not require any knowledge. And like when I was learning Scala and I want to have my simple web server out there, I just want to deploy. Do not think about plugins I need to install and modify the SBT. This is friction. This is actually losing the sight of the things that I need at hand to solve. So we want to build and we want to make so the basic stuff that are really basic can be done pretty much without any knowledge. They can be discovered without going through the documentation, and one can just do it and enjoy and focus on the actual problem at hand. Then there is a binary compatibility and many cases the dependencies hell that people faced. And binary compatibility is going to be much better with testing. We got the foundations. Now we need to build tools. So we will work on that as well. But there is also this dependency health story. So whenever there is a conflict in a dependency, conflict that has a catastrophic results for your application, and when you are tasked to fix that conflict, this is probably the worst task of the month that you get. And we want to transform that experience, providing tool and help, because we will not be able to remove the conflict, because conflicts in the dependencies will be with us. But we can make so the experience of removing that conflict is just yet another task that you have, not the nightmare that you need to live through and tell your friends how bad it was. And then in the long run, there are various of the simple things, and we want to address the paradox of choice here. Because when I'm developing a simple server, I just want to serve a simple a simple request, or even maybe web server is complicated. Let's think about I want to get a HTTP request somewhere, or I want to parse the JSON files. I want to do it once, and the file is small, and I do not care if it breaks or not because it's just my small application. Currently, I got amazing libraries to pick from, amazing libraries that are built, that aimed to be used with the enterprise class application to be able to handle thousands of requests per second. But I need to learn them, I need to skip, I need to pick them, and that's a friction. And we believe that for simple things, we should have simple libraries that will solve those problems simply. And one of the missions for that we've got is to compose a set of such libraries. So people will be able to just do their simple tasks and learn Scala and then grow to the more advanced one. And if libraries are simple, then we got the tools like Scalafix that can be a leverage to actually migrate to those more powerful ones later on when the application grows. And there is one more aspect, because those roadmap is based on what we are able to gather from our colleagues from various online sources. But we feel that we missed quite a lot in terms of the voice of the people that are out there. So that is why we want, and we will share that on the chat, we will tweet it as well. We just start with a simple form where anybody is invited to report what is causing the friction in their daily life, what is make that they lose the focus from what he or she or anyone needs to fix in the task at hand. And because people that quit Scala, that learn Scala, are not always the people that wants to speak that loudly publicly. And we were shocked when we talked with the developers, like transition from different languages to Scala, how differently they approach and how differently they see various things. Sometimes there are small things like the stack traces we showed earlier, but we want to enable everyone to actually have a way to let us know so we can build those roadmaps as I showed and address better the actual problems within our community.
And with that, let me proceed to the closing note of this presentation. So I think our deep belief is that Scala 3 gives us a chance for a fantastic growth, and one that we haven't seen for the last couple of years. And if that's true, there is going to be a lot more newcomers into the ecosystem. And perhaps there would be more newcomers than there is overall the number of the people in the community right now, if we are very successful. And if that's true, that means that we need to be very mindful about the first impression these developers get when they enter the Scala ecosystem. We don't want to lose them after first 1, 2, or 3 weeks of work. And we also want to make sure that the companies that are using Scala production systems are not experiencing frictions and are treating Scala in the ecosystem as a reliable technology. And perhaps last but not least, we strongly believe that we all here as individuals, as community members, as various community groups, or even as different commercial entities competing on the commercial market, we should all cooperate together to make sure that Scala gets the growth it deserves. Thank you very much.
Now we can take questions.
Thanks so much, and I think we're all very appreciative for your work on Scala 3. Everyone's super excited about that coming out in the community. So we've got a handful of questions for you. If we can, we'll try to get through as many as we can here. From your point of view, is Scala missing corporate support?
I'm gonna answer that. Yeah, I mean, is the question? I'm not entirely sure if it asks this question: is Scala missing corporate support, or is Scala 3 missing the corporate support? So I'm assuming that we are talking about Scala in general. So I think that the answer is yes. And then I said it doesn't necessarily mean that the corporate support needs to be something that is being sold. It needs to be something that companies are aware that this thing exists. That's the key point.
Okay. Next up, what are you most excited for about Scala Native?
The new niches where Scala can be ported. Like, I would love to be able to program gadgets with Scala, like Arduino, for example, or learning kids how to program with Raspberry Pi and Scala, or just having other areas like lambdas and other places where like programs need to be short-lived. And for tooling, I mean, I should mention that in the presentation, but Scala FMT powered by Scala Native is coming really soon. That will make formatting in Scala much better and much faster.
Great. About being frictionless, some devs consider the JVM friction enough to not use Scala. Do you see a future where developing in Scala without the JVM would be possible or desirable?
Is it just the answer for like my previous answer was exactly for that? Like Scala Native and Scala JS, like Scala Native is going to be, Scala Native is the alternative for JVM. And yes, JVM is just one of the runtimes, and we live in the world where we need to diversify it. So yeah, we see that JVM might cause some friction, bring us a lot of benefits, and we want to live in the world where we have an option to pick something else than JVM.
I also think that from the perspective of the JVM itself, there is this work around the Graal VM ecosystem, and I think as the work unfolds and it's more being it's more common in the industry, that might also change with the native imaging and things like that, and might also change our perception of the heavyweight JVM that is behind Scala, right?
Okay. Is Spark still the most frequently used library in the companies that you provide support to, or do you see emerging patterns?
No, the Spark is not. Like, there are two different, like we see this world like two different things in like two different parts of this world with the customers that we work with. One is distributed systems, and there is no Spark at all. And those companies or projects. And then there is data engineering slash data science, maybe areas where Spark is still being extensively used. So I think that with some recent developments might be changing that, but I'm not entirely sure if I can say that there is, some emerging pattern. It's definitely only affects this part with the data engineering. We still see a lot of interest, for instance, in the distributed systems. There's still a lot of interest into, for instance, Akastok.
What things are you going to do to encourage the community to be more welcoming? Many Scala devs see the difficulty as a badge of honor and don't care about making things easier for new devs.
Yeah.
I mean, community is one thing for being more welcoming, and the communities where we have we really take our part more, like for example Metals or Dotty guitars. I mean, Dotty was close, but Scala, they're really welcome for newcomers, and they're really open for newcomers to learn. Like, I don't want to, to argue with anyone that says that the difficulty is a badge of honor. And to be honest, like, you can even make a certification for people that really want to have this kind of extreme depth of Scala if they really like that. But the growth of Scala, if the people that see the difficulty as a badge of honor, if they want to do that difficult Scala, they need a lot of people that coming into Scala to replace one that just want to switch a language, or just to get the Scala grow and get into more exciting areas. So yeah, that is why I think that it's more about, not about the community being more welcoming in terms of like giving badge of honor or for being difficult, but more about creating tools and experience for developers where they can just start using given language on Scala.
I also would add to that I think there is something like a critical mass for something to take off, and we see like that, and that is true. And all of things in Scala is aimed into more sophisticated use case, but more often than not means that it's inevitably more complicated. But we also see work in a different direction. Like, for instance, I mentioned Lee Howey, who is famous of making, libraries that are by definition very simple. They mimic the way how Python is being built, and I think how Python libraries are being built. And I think that there is something like a critical mass. If there is an example and there is traction, and we make, say again, to make it attractive. Again, to write simple things, because we were at this point some time ago. I'd argue that at the very early days, maybe around 2020 or something like 2010 or something like that, the first version of Play, or maybe version of 2.0, they were relatively simple compared to what happened later. So there was a point in time when it was perceived as a badge of honor to make something simple and to advertise Scala as something that would help you to build systems more efficiently and easier from the perspective of simplicity. And I think that there is work that we can do in community in promoting the simple approach once again.
And also there is like the thing I can say about this, like there is a limit where the friction in terms of like, vehicles can give you up to speed. If you really want to go fast, we need to eliminate the friction. And I think Scala is really fast and getting as much speed as possible based on that friction, on this difficulty. Now it's time to lift off and leave the friction behind.
Absolutely, and I know, both with Virtus Labs and the work, 47 Degrees as well on the Scala Center committee, that a lot of actions are in place to improve the community, and people will be seeing more work about that soon. But thank you both so much. I know that you will both be in your booth, which people can check out at the virtual expo hall if they have any further questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy the conference.